The Vietnam War is one of the most defining moments in recent history. It radically altered global geopolitics, completely reshaping the balance of power around the world. But how exactly did it do this? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. But before we get into all of that, now back to the video. So let's start with the immediate aftermath of the war and then work our way outwards. One of the first major consequences of the war was the mass exodus of people out of Vietnam itself. Over 1 million Vietnamese refugees fled their country, heading mostly to neighboring countries such as Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. These nations were already quite poor themselves, so this influx of refugees caused some serious economic and social problems. For example, refugee camps quickly became overcrowded and under-resourced, leading to outbreaks of disease and famine. There was also a lot of tension between the refugees and the locals, which sometimes boiled over into violence. However, this also created an opportunity for other nations, particularly the United States, who began to see the Vietnamese refugees as a potential source of cheap labor. So they began offering them asylum in America, which is how many Vietnamese people ended up in the US today. In fact, this trend would go beyond just the Vietnamese, marking the beginning of a massive wave of Asian immigration into America that continues even today. The war also had a huge impact on the political landscape of Southeast Asia. The creation of modern Vietnam itself was the result of decades of conflict. Not just the Vietnam War, but also the First Indochina War against the Dutch, and the subsequent struggle to unify the North and the South. Before the Vietnam War, the region was politically fragmented with French-backed South Vietnam, US-backed South Vietnam, Communist North Vietnam, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and various other factions vying for power. The war basically just blew all of these factions away, leaving only two: Communist Vietnam and a weakened US-backed Cambodia. This meant that the US could no longer use the region as a bulwark against communism, which was spreading throughout Asia like wildfire. And so they established relations with their new ally, Communist China. In order to contain the spread of communism throughout Asia, this process of normalizing relations between the US and China would accelerate significantly after President Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972. This visit paved the way for diplomatic relations between the two nations in 1979, marking a major shift in the Cold War rivalry. And that is not all, because the end of the war also marked the official end of the French colonial era. France had been in the process of decolonizing their empire since the end of World War II. But the last vestiges of that empire were the French-speaking nations of Indochina, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Vietnam War was a final and bloody chapter in this process. The end of the war saw France completely withdraw from Indochina, officially ending their colonial empire once and for all. The Vietnam War also played a pivotal role in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. See, when the war began in the early 1950s, the USSR and its allies provided crucial military aid to their comrades in North Vietnam. As the war dragged on, and the US became more and more bogged down in the conflict, the Soviets began to worry that if the US managed to win, it would spell disaster for them. You see, since World War II, the US and the USSR had been locked in a deadly embrace. They competed economically, militarily, and politically, trying to outdo each other at every turn. And the Vietnam War was a clear example of this. The Soviets were adamant that if the US won in Vietnam, they would be emboldened to win elsewhere, potentially causing a wider conflict. Therefore, in order to stop the Americans, the Soviets began funneling more and more weapons and resources into North Vietnam. By 1965, they were providing over half of all military aid to North Vietnam. Now, while this helped the North Vietnamese tremendously, it was a disaster for the Soviet Union. Providing all of this aid put a massive strain on the Soviet economy, which was already weak due to inefficient planning and corruption. And by the early 1970s, it was clear that the Soviet Union couldn't keep this up forever. When North Vietnam finally won the war in 1975, it essentially marked the end of the Soviet Union's ability to play the role of superpower. Just 4 years later, they would be completely dissolved. But the war wasn't just important for international relations. It also fundamentally changed the way that warfare is conducted around the world. The Vietnam War was the first war where both sides used guerrilla tactics. The Viet Cong were masters of this style of warfare, utilizing the dense jungles and complex network of tunnels to launch surprise attacks on the Americans. In response, the U.S. military developed new technologies and strategies to counter these attacks. This included things like advanced surveillance equipment, new aircraft and helicopters, and new tactics like search and destroy missions. Many of these innovations would go on to be used in future conflicts and would eventually evolve into modern counterinsurgency tactics. The Vietnam War also played a significant role in the development of the modern Middle East. During the war, the U.S. began to rely heavily on Saudi Arabia as a strategic ally. This was because the Saudis controlled the world's largest oil reserves, which the U.S. needed to fuel their war machine. In return, the U.S. provided the Saudis with military and economic aid, helping to solidify their position of power in the region. After the war, this relationship continued with the U.S. supporting the Saudis in their ongoing conflict with Iran. This support has only grown since then, the U.S. still being a major supplier of weapons and military technology to Saudi Arabia even today. The Vietnam War also led to a surge in investigative journalism. As the war dragged on and the body count rose, Americans began to question the purpose of the war and the way it was being conducted. This led to a new breed of journalists who uncovered stories of war crimes and government cover-ups. These journalists were often seen as being anti-war and were sometimes even branded as such. But their investigations helped to bring about greater transparency and accountability in government, leading to reforms that have had a lasting impact on American journalism. So we can see that the Vietnam War had a profound impact on the world. But perhaps its most significant legacy is the way it changed American society. The war was deeply divisive, causing widespread protests and riots across the country. It also led to a deep sense of disillusionment with the government, which would continue for decades. But despite the negative consequences, the war also had some positive effects on America. It led to major advancements in technology and medicine, as well as a growing awareness of social issues like civil rights and gender equality. Overall, the war was a traumatic experience for the country, but one that ultimately helped to shape America into the nation it is today. And if you want to learn about another major event that shaped America, then I highly recommend you check out our video on the Watergate scandal. It's a fascinating story that will give you a whole new perspective on American history. The Vietnam War didn't just change one nation, it changed the world. From military tactics to public opinion, its impact still echoes today. If this video gave you a new perspective, give it a thumbs up. And let me know in the comments. What do you think was the most lasting legacy of the Vietnam War? And if you love uncovering how history shapes our present, subscribe to HistoroMystic and turn on notifications. There's so much more to explore.